very much, Randy, and I'd like to try and link my talk a little bit to what you've already heard. I'm going to talk about a drug that we have known about for many, many decades that's been traditionally used as an anesthetic. And then a group at Yale noticed that, well, first of all, people in the party scene discovered that ketamine had a very interesting set of effects when you were awake, much more interesting than when you're asleep in a party scene. And hence Special K was born, and people were tripping and continued tripping all over the world using ketamine. But because it produced this kind of psychotomimetic effect, people were using it for the treatment, for the study of schizophrenia and psychosis. A group at Yale noticed that when they gave it to healthy volunteers who were not as healthy as they appeared, but were actually depressed, that the depressed individuals described a dramatic improvement in their mood. So they were getting a very low dose, a la the party scene. They weren't particularly impressed necessarily by the tripping effect, but they were really struck by the degree of improvement in their mood. And that's when the hard work began. So this became, in a way, a groundbreaking discovery. An astute clinician finding something that's completely unexpected and out of context. So with a series of studies, of which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, it was discovered that ketamine not only produced a robust and rapid antidepressant effect, even in people who hadn't been responding very well to antidepressants, conventional antidepressants, but it also produced a comparably robust and rapid improvement in suicidal ideation. And this was, again, something that was very much unlike any other known psychotherapeutic agent. And the question is, that arose almost immediately was, is the improvement in the suicidal ideation entirely due to the fact that it works so well for depression? And the answer, I'm going to give you the answer in advance, was no, which is kind of counterintuitive. And so the question that raised was, what other mechanism or set of properties could ketamine have that would also contribute to the improvement in suicidal ideation? Because if we could discover what that was, we could start to discover a greater array of therapeutic targets whereby we could make patients rapidly safe. So it was really very important. And then we also, because like Christine, my group is very interested in the biology of psychiatric disorders, particularly depression and suicidal behavior. We wanted to understand where ketamine's actions fit in with what we know of the biology of depression and of suicidal behavior. For that, I need to introduce you to two new people, if you like, two new neurotransmitters. Some of you may be familiar with these neurotransmitters. The first one is glutamate, and the second one is called GABA. So what does glutamate do scientifically? It's known as an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's actually the most abundant, or one of the most abundant neurotransmitters in the brain, and it has an excitatory effect. It stimulates activity in the neurons that it targets. It also does other things. It is involved in memory formations and in mood and a whole variety of other factors, but it basically activates the neurons that it targets. The second is GABA, and GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It does the opposite. It does that by making the neurons hyperpolarized. That's the opposite of what would make them hyperactive. In other words, it's harder to produce an electrical signal in the neuron. But what this actually means in terms of practical things is that by making neurons harder to activate, it means the brain quietens down. So we use GABAergic drugs as the front line of treatment of epilepsy, which is a condition in which part and then perhaps eventually all of the brain becomes in a hyper-excitatory state. So we prevent the development of an epileptic seizure by using drugs that enhance the effects of GABA. Also, another way of thinking about the quieting of the brain, maybe it's a little allegorical, is anti-anxiety agents. And the most commonly known anti-anxiety agents are benzodiazepines, known colloquially as benzos. And what do benzos do? They stimulate GABA receptors. They activate GABA receptors, which reduce activity in neurons and has a behaviorally or feeling-wise, emotionally, an anti-anxiety effect. Now, the question is, what's happening in depression? And in depression, there's quite a bit of data indicating that the pathology of depression involves an alteration in both these two neurotransmitter systems, excessive amounts of glutamate and lower amounts of GABA. And in fact, those two neurotransmitters work together in the brain to try and regulate each other. If you have too much excitatory activity in the brain, the GABAergic system tries to kick in to calm the brain down. And if you have too much inhibitory activity in the brain, the glutamatergic system tries to counter that. You can see this in all kinds of interesting ways. So I mentioned to you that glutamate, for example, helps memory. And those of you who have tried taking a bit of a benzodiazepine on a plane flight will realize that your memory has been affected by the benzodiazepine. It has an amnestic effect. So they work together. The brain tries to have multiple redundant regulatory systems to keep it in the sweet spot. We can ill afford malfunction in our brain. Where does ketamine fit into this biological puzzle or model? So the first place is that ketamine, interestingly enough, blocks one of the most important receptors that are involved in the action of glutamate, and that's called the NMDA receptor. Don't worry if you don't remember the name, NMDA receptor. One of the effects of ketamine is a two-edged sword. In the right amount, it's critical to memory formation and learning. But in excessive amounts, it can actually, by overstimulating the neurons, kind of batter them to death and produce a neurotoxic effect. That neurotoxic effect is mediated through that NMDA receptor. So if you have an excessive amount of glutamate because you have depression, that is actually eating away at your brain. That may account for one of the reasons why certain critical areas of the brain in untreated depressed patients are about half the size of what they should be in healthy people, like the dentate gyrus and the hippocampus, half the size in untreated depression. So some of that may be mediated through the NMDA receptor, and you can see right away ketamine blocks that potential toxic effect. And what it does that's good for you is it then leaves unblocked another set of receptors that glutamate activates, and that is they're called the AMPA receptors, AMPA, AMPA receptors. If you like amping yourself up a bit, AMPA receptors mediate the brain growth effect of glutamate. When you learn and memorize things, the first thing you do is produce the kind of pattern of neuronal activation that Christine Denny can show you in the mice. A sort of amalgam of linked neurons specific to a specific memory. But what produces the persistence of that memory is a change in the structure of the connectivity of that collection of neurons, and that occurs through synapse formation, and that is mediated through the AMPA receptor. So right away you can see two critical properties of ketamine, both help the brain in important but different ways. So that you can see in this a clever bidirectional switching railway arrow signal. Ketamine redirects glutamate activity from the NMDA receptor where it's excessive into the AMPA receptor where it's restorative. Now, what does ketamine do in depression? This is where the hard work starts. The Yale group made this amazing discovery, but luckily for us, we got the 3 big NIMH grants to try and evaluate what this all meant. So we had an idea. We gave ketamine 1 injection, 1 IV administration over 40 minutes, which is the standard way it's given. We started by measuring how depressed patients were by psychometrics. We then put the person in an MRI scanner. They go into the scanner depressed. We then started taking, we then did 2 things. We gave them ketamine for a 40-minute infusion, IV, which is a standard delivery method. And at the same time, we took these multiple pictures of their brains, measuring their glutamate and GABA levels. So we started measuring when they were still depressed, and we scanned them repeatedly all the way through the infusion until they came out the other end, and many of them were cheerful. And this was our idea of trying to do the Big Bang Theory. Let's see what happens at the very beginning. What is the thing that happens that kicks off the amazing therapeutic result of this drug? And we'll watch it as it's happening and evolving in the human brain, as it's in real time. And then after that, for 60 minutes after they're out of the scanner, we got much more data about what it was like in the scanner and how they felt afterwards. And then we repeated that 24 hours later, and then, as you see, 3 days later and 7 days later. So after 24 hours, when you saw pretty much the maximal antidepressant effect, we then linked that to the dose of ketamine that we had given. And we gave them either 0, which is like placebo, or we gave them 0.1 milligram, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. And you can see that the order of improvement that occurred after they had gotten the ketamine was exactly the order of the dose that they had gotten. The ones that got 0 got the least improvement, and the ones that got the maximum dose got the maximum improvement. So this was really striking. It showed you how exquisitely sensitive ketamine's response is to the correct dose. And then we decided to do a clinical trial and look over time, a bit like Christine Denny's study with the mice. What happens over time? This is 1 injection. Can this really be sustained? So this is where Mike Grunbaum comes in. He's in our division. He is a clinical trialist, a very gifted clinical trialist. And so he carried out the following study. He used this drug called midazolam, which is a benzodiazepine, as a control, not a placebo, because ketamine has many effects on the brain and the person can tell they're getting it. We needed what's called an active control drug. And then we compared the two. And here are the results. First, we gave midazolam. And there's a bit of an improvement when you give midazolam to a patient IV. Then we gave them ketamine, and there is a bigger improvement. And not only is there an improvement, you can see there's the beginnings of relapse on midazolam, and if you continued waiting, it would go right back to baseline. But with ketamine, it's amazingly sustained. This doesn't happen with just a change in electrical activity. That AMPA receptor mediated production of synapses is critical to sustaining this improvement for weeks. Mind you, they stayed on their regular antidepressants. These people didn't come off their antidepressants. We optimized their antidepressants. So this was a good Columbia psychiatrist combined with a shot of ketamine. The final bit of data that I meant to tell you was we gave ketamine after midazolam because everybody was entitled to a shot of ketamine. You can see that the ketamine after midazolam pretty much reproduces what the ketamine alone would have done. Maybe not quite as good, but pretty close. The next thing we showed was that this was not just true for people with MDD, major depressive disorder. This is also true for bipolar patients when they're depressed. It's equally impressive. Here's midazolam, and here is ketamine, and it's a distinctly better result. And if you look over 6 weeks, which is in that little bumpy thing, it looks bumpier because we had fewer patients. We didn't have as much grant money. We couldn't do as many, so it looks bumpier. But essentially, you can see that pretty much the improvement is sustained over the 6 weeks. So it looks very similar. We even looked at adolescents because people said this, adolescents don't respond to antidepressants. In fact, it's hard to find data to support a lot of the standard antidepressants working in adolescents. But this wasn't true here. We found that ketamine produced a distinctly better result compared to midazolam. So now I want to come back to the question I asked at the very beginning, and this is where I'm going to end. How else can ketamine help? And how does it work? So first of all, we found that ketamine not only produced these kinds of effects in mice that you saw, and in man, that suggested that there was some kind of biological change through synapses, for example, but we could actually see that white matter, which is the cabling that connects neurons to each other, that bulks up in patients when they're treated with ketamine. In a subgroup of our patients, we did MRIs before and after treatment, and we saw this increase. Next thing, we showed that there was a clear improvement in memory performance in our patients, and that part of the reason that their suicidal ideation got better was correlated with these other kinds of cognitive improvements that occurred in the patients with ketamine. And finally, there was this dramatic effect on suicidal ideation, which was accounted for by these other effects unrelated to the improvement in depression. So we believe in bringing the latest treatments to the public, whether or not they can afford to get the treatment. And so we set up a ketamine clinic at Columbia. Our ketamine clinic is not designed to serve the elite. It is designed to bring treatment to the people who need it. And so we're very proud of that. And this is really the kind of approach that we're trying to bring to our whole medical school, which is to make the important findings and make them available. Thank you.